Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. James Blair.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Really grateful to have also an intergenerational crowd here with the high school students. Welcome, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about my community engaged research on the social and environmental impacts of mining for what are sometimes called critical materials or critical minerals, or sometimes they're also called energy transition minerals. In particular, I'm going to talk about lithium. Lithium, as you may know, is a key component of batteries for electric vehicles, as well as energy storage and our portable electronic devices. A lot of my recent research has been conducted in collaboration with communities in proximity to an array of different extractive industries that Jennifer just described, right? Fossil fuels, mining, logging, dams. And in a lot of these areas, I've done a lot of work in South America as well as in Canada and here in California. What you find is that in the social scientific literature, they're sometimes now described as sacrifice zones. They're called sacrifice zones because these are areas where their landscape has really been destroyed by resource extraction. But what's more, these are some of the same communities and environments that are most likely to experience harm due to the stressors of climate change: high temperature, drought, erratic rainfall, and flooding. Right, so this means that these are communities and environments that they need to recover and they need to restore as well as adapt to a warming planet. So this precarious situation makes climate change mitigation especially urgent. But the question I want to pose today is, what happens when efforts to tackle greenhouse gas emissions through things like lithium mining, how does that sometimes lead to an increase in these climate stressors in these sorts of sacrifice zones? This is what some people call a kind of rebounding vulnerability. It's an unintended consequence of climate change that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change calls maladaptive mitigation. So my work advances this focus on maladaptive mitigation and contributes to a growing body of social science that analyzes how extractive industries, the expansion of mining for the energy transition, can be described as a kind of green extractivism. So what are green extractivisms? Well, it's a variant of extractivisms which are centered generally on natural resource appropriation through, often having negative local impacts on ecology and society. And green extractivism in particular operates under the assumption that the expansion of mining and other extractive industries is required in order to have sustainable development, in order to fight climate change, right? And this has come at a critical conjuncture when the urgency of addressing climate change overshadows sometimes local ecological problems or environmental injustices. So it's really those tensions between the kind of global problem of climate change and local ecological and social problems that I'm really interested in. Okay, so where does lithium fit into this? Let's kind of take a step back, talk about the basics of what is lithium, what are lithium-ion batteries. Lithium is a key ingredient in lithium-ion batteries. I mentioned before, right, those power electric vehicles, energy grid storage, portable electronic devices, the laptop I'm using right now, right, in addition to direct uses in ceramics and glass and other products. Lithium is the lightest of the elemental metals, and it plays an important role in carrying a charge between the anode and the cathode in batteries. That's why lithium plays such a significant role in batteries. And currently, lithium is mined in two main ways. You don't need to necessarily read all the details of this, but I'll give you a quick overview. The two main ways that it's mined is first the orange there, which is open pit mining of ore, right, mineral ore. In other words, big holes in the ground, right? It's extracted from hard rock pegmatites, especially in Australia, for example, spodumene, as well as increasingly, there's been a lot of development of lithium from sedimentary clay. And this is what we see now with some protests and litigation, but currently happening in the US state of Nevada currently. The other one, the blue there, is brine evaporation. That's the other conventional extraction method for lithium. And that means that lithium is extracted from brine, which I'll go into a lot more detail. We're talking about mineralized groundwater, or really salty groundwater. And it's pumped up from beneath these arid basins in places like Argentina and Chile. So both of these conventional methods of extracting lithium have been under some scrutiny recently due to heightened concerns over water, in addition to not just water consumption and water contamination, but also land use issues and indigenous rights violations, a lot of other things. And so to avoid these kinds of pitfalls of open pit mining and evaporation, there's been some innovative approaches, and that's what you see there in the green, which is labeled DLE, direct lithium extraction. Direct lithium extraction can take different kinds of forms, but basically these are approaches to extract lithium from brine solutions within their aqueous saline matrix. This has the potential to process all kinds of different brines. The continental brines that we see for evaporation that are closer to the surface and are pretty concentrated, as well as geothermal brines that are far beneath the earth, or oil field brines that have a whole different kinds of geology. And it doesn't require necessarily evaporation ponds, but it's still a pretty new technology, and it's more in the research and development stage, unlike open pit mining and brine evaporation. Okay. So those are the extraction methods, and we can go into a little more detail, especially about brine and DLE later. But I want to start with the first half of this talk by providing a brief overview of some of the key takeaways from a report that we published in 2022 with the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC, and it's called Exhausted: How We Can Stop Lithium Mining from Depleting Water Resources, Draining Wetlands, and Harming Communities in South America. Our collaborator for this report was a group called the Plurinational Observatory of Andean Salt Flats, or OPSAL. I recommend going to their website if you're interested in this issue. They have a lot of news that they send out, a regular newsletter, mostly in Spanish, but also with English translations sometimes. We also had an academic article version of this that was published in International Development Policy. So the borderland area of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile is commonly referred to by industry and by government as the lithium triangle because of all this brine evaporation that happens there. We prefer in the report to call it the Puna de Atacama. Calling it the Puna de Atacama really shows a little bit more of a sense of this area's significance as an ecoregion, its geography and its meaning to people. And I want to just point out also that the maps that I'm going to show, especially in the first half of this presentation, were all made by an outstanding undergraduate student at Cal Poly Pomona named Brenda Rojas. But this area, the Puna de Atacama, or the Atacama Desert, is, especially in northern Chile, is one of the most arid deserts in the world. It's got almost no annual rainfall. And mining is exacerbating what's becoming also a kind of perpetual drought in this area. But despite being a desert, the area is really not at all a wasteland. On the contrary, it's home to wetlands. Wetlands, though, have been identified as some of the world's most threatened ecosystems, right? They serve as key sites for migratory birds, and a lot of the lagoons in this area host, a few different species of flamingos and other rare wildlife. But what's happening is the stressors of brine extraction as well as other mining in the area on water availability are posing a significant threat. The most immediately impacted life forms are the unique species of microbes and bacteria that are at actually risk of extinction in some cases directly due to brine evaporation. Scientists, biodiversity conservationists are now concerned that this could have other kinds of knock-on effects for more charismatic species higher up on the food chain, like the flamingos, and they've actually found that the combined effects of climate change together with lithium mining have decreased the populations locally of 2 out of the 3 species of flamingos in the Atacama Salt Flat. So this could be understood as a kind of example of maladaptive mitigation, right? There's displacement of species from a biodiverse area, and there's direct links to efforts for climate change mitigation through lithium mining to produce batteries for EVs. Now, water from springs has allowed for humans to adapt to this arid environment since at least 10,000 BCE until now in the Atacama Desert. And the Atacameño or Licanantay people have really centered on their livelihood and culture on growing crops, on raising livestock. But what you find in the same area, right around the Atacama Salt Flat, are four main mining operations, right? Two of them are copper mines. Copper mines is, conventional open pit mining I described earlier. And then the other two are lithium mines by companies SQM, which is a Chilean company, and Albemarle, which is a US company. And the availability of water for irrigation in this area has been decreasing because of all the water used for mining. And what you find is that the irrigation associations locally have requested what they call a declaration of exhaustion. And that was actually ratified in 2017. That basically meant that the aquifer was depleted and you couldn't extract any more water from it at that time. So how does this relate to brine evaporation, and how does brine evaporation work exactly? Well, in order for lithium to emerge from brine, the operators drill the crust of the salt flat, and they begin pumping brine at sometimes a rate of 1,700 liters per second. That's in the case of one of the companies at least, and brine then is distributed through these cascading evaporation pools, and they basically soak up the sun for something like 18 to 24 months in some cases, and that's when the lithium is really concentrated. That process then means that 95% of the brine water evaporates. But besides brine, there's also a lot of extraction of fresh water in order to chemically treat the brine with lime to remove impurities, and also to use soda ash so that they can precipitate and separate lithium carbonate, which can then be used for battery manufacturing, usually in China. So, this kind of raises questions about, are these places mines or are they wetlands? And how do they regulate these places that have these lagoons but also have mines in this area? And this map here shows the clear encroachment of mining on wetlands in this broader area of northern Chile. Several of these wetlands are actually Ramsar protected sites or nature reserves. But the laws governing lithium extraction in Chile, they interpret brine as a mineral resource, not as water. And they generally understand or interpret the salt flats as being regulated as mines rather than wetlands. It's important to note that scientists still have not reached a consensus about the way that the groundwater interacts with brine in this area. So some hydrogeological studies in the Atacama salt flat, which again, it can be different depending on the salt flat and the region. Sometimes they'll say that there's this sort of saline barrier, a mixing zone, that separates the brine nucleus that's getting pumped up for lithium mining from the surrounding wetlands and lagoon ecosystems. But it's important to note that brine is not static. It's hydrodynamic. It is interconnected with freshwater. So there's still concerns about the potential depletion of freshwater flowing into the salt flats as brine is being pumped. Brine takes millions of years to form, so it's not a renewable resource. And it bears reminding that brine, again, is mainly liquid. Even though it has dissolved solids, it's mineralized or saline groundwater. And to the indigenous Atacameño or Licanantay people, there's only one water, called puri, in their language Kunsa. And this includes both brine and the surrounding lagoon systems. And so this is why some scholars of green extractivism describe this form of mining as water mining. The communities around the salt flats are not monolithic. Their relations are complex with one another, between communities, within communities, as well as with the companies. But on both the Chilean and the Argentine sides of the Puna de Atacama, there's been protests, there's been legal actions, especially recently, against the expansion of mining that is needed to meet demand for electric vehicles, especially in the global north. One example from the Atacameño Licanantay community of Toconao is Rudecindo Cristian Espíndola, who says, quote, "The development takes place in Toconao and the agriculture in that area starts to decay. Craft work starts to decay. Customs start to go down. This monster is called Mining with SQM or Albemarle. Those are the two companies for lithium. It transforms the thoughts and way of life of Native people in a way that causes division. They tell us lithium is clean, we can offer a way of life, but unfortunately they're winning over there and we're losing over here. They're drying up our waters, they're drying up the conscience we're lacking. So as a result of our community-engaged research, we had a number of different recommendations, and you can go online, of course, and check out our report. The first, I just want to condense them here, talk about, is applying international human rights principles. There's different kinds of international laws that could apply in this situation. ILO 169, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and People Working in Rural Areas, the Escazú Regional Agreement for Protecting Environmental Defense. These are all relevant, especially for making sure that there's free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples in this area. Second is to strengthen environmental standards. In particular, in Chile, we recommend that authorities could reclassify brine as water rather than a mineral so that they can better monitor and safeguard this resource. Third is to build collaborative monitoring practices. This is actually already happening, and it's really impressive to see what the Indigenous Council of Atacameños has been doing to create a whole environmental monitoring unit. And you can see how Western science is complementary with indigenous ways of understanding this landscape. And this can be really important, not just for monitoring, but for building local food production, for safeguarding biodiversity as well. This was maybe controversial at the time of our report, but we recommended enforcing a moratorium on brine evaporation through application of the precautionary principle. And even though that seemed like this would be controversial at the time because of the need for lithium for electric vehicles, that recommendation was actually adopted by the Chilean government through a new national lithium strategy that was announced last year. And what we're seeing now is a shift. Even though lithium mining is going to be expanded, there's going to be a shift in the method of extraction from brine evaporation to DLE, to direct lithium extraction, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in just a second. And then finally, we can reduce the need for new batteries. We can do that through a variety of different ways. We can recycle, reuse batteries. We can repurpose batteries for other uses of energy storage. And then we can also have long-term planning for alternative transportation methods. Public transportation, bicycling, walking, denser cities, things like that. And there was a great report I would recommend from colleagues at the Climate and Community Project on exactly this, which is about more mobility with less mining. So, having already done some research and advocacy on the dynamics of brine evaporation and maladaptive mitigation through lithium mining in South America, I felt like it was important to address these problems closer to home as well. And so recently, the past few years, I've been really focused on researching the proposed lithium mining at the Salton Sea, in the southeast edge of the Salton Sea. This is in Imperial Valley, California. Again, the southeast edge of California, kind of near the border with Mexico and Arizona. And this is an area that is a disadvantaged community that generally has a lot of Mexican migrant farm worker and their families. And there's a high amount of unemployment in this area. So there's a lot of excitement about the possibility that there could be a new economy that could provide jobs, that could provide benefits locally. And some folks at Berkeley Lab have recently estimated that there could be 18 million metric tons of lithium that could be extracted in this area. And this is not from the Salton Sea itself. It's from about a mile below. Really, really deep geothermal brine. And I'll talk about what that brine's like in a moment. So that's enough lithium that could potentially make over 375 million batteries for electric vehicles, which is more than there are actually on the road today in the United States. And what's more, this is also through an extraction method called geothermal direct lithium extraction, or geothermal DLE. That is a chemical process that's designed to be less destructive than those conventional methods of extraction like brine evaporation or open pit mining. So how does this work? Well, rather than evaporating brine, This process is meant to be a closed loop that couples renewable energy production with lithium extraction for electric vehicle batteries. So very hot brine basically is brought up to the surface, and that very hot brine, which again is like a mineralized groundwater, that is used to flash steam. And the steam then turns turbines that generate electricity, right? And it's considered to be a renewable form of electricity because that brine, after it's cooled, is re-injected into the same deposit, right? So that's why some people describe it comparable to solar or wind energy, other kinds of renewable energy. The proposal now is to couple that with lithium extraction through DLE, through these chemical processes like ion exchange or adsorption or electrochemical processes. And the idea is basically before it's re-injected to actually extract lithium directly from that brine. And again, it just so happens that there's quite a lot of lithium in that brine at the Salton Sea. So this has been framed as a cleaner alternative rather than brine evaporation or open pit mining. And you know, people like to describe it as even lithium recovery rather than lithium extraction. I'll talk about some potential concerns about it still though. And I do think it's worth reminding that the E in DLE still stands for extraction after all. So geothermal DLE, again, I do want to emphasize, is not proven at a commercial or industrial scale. It's been under development, and there is a lot of enthusiasm, but it's very different from what we see in South America, where brine evaporation's been happening for decades. So a little bit of background on the Salton Sea. We're in Southern California currently, so maybe some folks are familiar with it or its history. The Salton Sea was previously part of this larger Lake Cahuilla, which resulted from the periodic flooding of the Colorado River. And the basin of the Salton Sea had dried up completely until the early 1900s when there was a malfunction in a gate, an irrigation gate, that caused water from the Colorado River to flood this basin. And as a result, the Salton Sea became an important wetland for migratory birds, as well as an agricultural sump that really changed its ecosystem over time, right? But some people may remember in the mid-20th century, the Salton Sea was actually a vacation destination, right? So people would go there in order to relax and unwind, and indeed, it is still a beautiful wetland. There's still camping and other possibilities for recreation there. This, again, like the Atacama, is a desert. The desert had already been an ecosystem that experiences water scarcity, of course. But in the early 1900s, there was so much re-engineering of the Colorado River that it allowed Imperial Valley to have year-long growing seasons. Agriculture really boomed, right? And so that has put food on the table for a lot of people. It also grows a lot of grass and alfalfa for cattle. But it's also resulted in a lot of pollution, including the concentration of chemical pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers that end up, when that irrigation water ends up draining, to the Salton Sea, which has basically no exit. Again, it acts as kind of a sump for this irrigation. So in 2003, a water transfer agreement diverted more of that water away from the Salton Sea to cities like San Diego and Los Angeles. And this has really negatively impacted the Salton Sea in addition to climate change. What we're finding is that the recession of the Salton Sea is causing more of the shoreline, which is referred to locally as the playa, to become exposed. And that's releasing toxic chemicals into the air that is harming community members. The image on your right-hand side there depicts the predicted levels of the Salton Sea as time goes on without any remediation. The outer level there of the dark blue is sort of the current levels or maybe a year or two ago. And then the body of water in the center is what is predicted if there were no restoration or remediation by the 2030s. Right, so this is a pretty rapid recession, and this rapid recession is becoming a major public health concern because, again, as the playa is exposed, air quality will further decrease as a result of all these chemicals and bacteria that are getting swept into the air in dust pollution. And so residents near the Salton Sea have really increased rates of adolescent asthma hospitalization. And of course, in the backdrop, all this water is coming from the Colorado River. And the Colorado River has entered long-term drought, which is going to have serious knock-on effects then for water availability throughout the region. Now, this is the proposed land use plan for Lithium Valley, which they're trying to rebrand Imperial Valley as Lithium Valley. And you don't need to necessarily, read all the different zones in the map there. But just to give you a sense, what they're envisioning is not just lithium extraction or geothermal energy production. They want to have those sorts of green industrial processes going on next to solar, next to data centers, green hydrogen, biofuel, battery manufacturing, logistics, you name it. And on top of that, what I really wanted to point out is sort of that orangey color or yellowish color, which is the area here where there's, again, the expectation that there's going to be more of that playa or shoreline exposed. And so the developers are interested in trying to access some of those geothermal resources that are deep beneath that area. And so they've actually had new zoning areas proposed for this, categories like playa renewables or playa restoration. And even playa restoration allows for some infrastructure for this industry to be there, like pipelines and other things. So there's been a very active public conversation about, what do they want for this area? Do they want restoration, or do they want it to become more industrial? And how can you have those two things in the same place? There's also serious concerns about tribal cultural resource protection. And indigenous elders like Carmen Lucas of the Quaimi Laguna Band of Indians, they point out that the same volcanic phenomena that are present in the geothermal lithium resource is reflected in sacred sites like this one, which is called Obsidian Butte. You can see the geothermal operations not very far in the horizon there. And there's proposals to build new geothermal plants in that same area, maybe 100 feet or a couple hundred feet away from this sacred site. There's also mud pots and geysers in this area that show how much this area is still actively volcanic, and it's really interesting landscape. So Carmen Lucas is trying to designate this all as part of a new Southeast Lake Cahuilla Active Volcanic Cultural District, to put it on the register and actually protect this with some kind of educational value. This was a report that came out last fall in November 2023 by my partners at Comité Cívico del Valle, which is an environmental justice organization in Imperial Valley, as well as Earthworks, which is a broader environmental group. And it really, I do recommend visiting this if you're very interested in this topic, because it outlines some of the key concerns about environmental justice in relation to the geothermal lithium extraction, which is they're not saying they're opposed to lithium extraction in this place because, everybody wants to mitigate climate change, but they want to do so with the best mitigation measures possible. And so they've highlighted some key concerns to address. The first one I've mentioned is water consumption. You might think, well, there's no evaporation. What is the concern about water? Well, actually, it turns out that DLE requires quite a lot of fresh water. You need a lot of fresh water. In some studies have even shown perhaps 10 times more fresh water is needed for DLE than brine evaporation, ironically. And that's because you need water to strip lithium from the sorbents and wash off acid and other resins and things like that in order to keep this process going. In addition to that, of course, the normal geothermal operations require fresh water as well. They need fresh water to dilute the brine, and also they need it for the cooling towers there. So again, in the context of drought in the Colorado River, there's a lot of concern about where that water is going to come from and how are they going to make that available. The second I've already mentioned is the Salton Sea degradation. If more water is used for this new industry, that means that even less water may arrive to the Salton Sea, and it could even exacerbate the recession of the Salton Sea that's already happening, which is in urgent need of restoration. And then, as a result of that, that could lead, again, to problems related to air quality, further dust pollution in an already degraded air basin, and there's already direct emissions of particulate matter, greenhouse gases, hydrogen chloride, and one of the problems also with geothermal plants that they need to control is the release of other emissions, like toxic non-condensable gases, such as hydrogen sulfide and even radon, which causes cancer. even though it's designed to be a closed-loop system through reinjection of brine, there's still a significant amount of solid waste that is generated from geothermal plants. And there's predicted to be even more solid waste as a result of pairing direct lithium extraction with geothermal plants. And that's because they need to remove a lot of what's called in the industry scaling or filter cake. This is this material that's kind of like sand. It's iron silica filter cake that may contain lead or arsenic, and about a little over half of that ends up in landfills locally. The other almost half of it ends up at hazardous waste facilities, usually in Arizona, if not other places. And then finally, there's concern locally because there are a lot of active earthquakes in the area about induced seismic activity as a result of drilling and reinjection of all this movement of brine up to the surface and back and forth, right? So there's some concerns about that as well. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. There's a lot of strong desire for local jobs, for community benefits. Again, this is an area that's really in need of a lot of economic development. But so far, we found that the necessary mitigation of local constraints for development is what is being framed for the community as benefits. So this is a quote from my community partner, Luis Olmedo at Comité Cívico del Valle, who says, quote, "Communities are often being sold mitigation as community benefits. If there's an increase of 100 trucks a day, we have to build a road, that's mitigation, not a community benefit. If there's a need for clean water, for wastewater, that's mitigation, not community benefit. That's how communities lose a lot of the times being robbed." So what kinds of community benefits could result from this? It turns out, geothermal plants have some jobs, not a whole lot of jobs. There's potential for a lot more jobs and perhaps, higher road jobs are called, better jobs from manufacturing batteries, but there's a lot of uncertainties about whether or not that'll actually occur in the same location or not. Well, one of the things that was considered sort of a victory for environmental justice communities in this area was this lithium tax that passed through AB 125. It's a lithium extraction excise tax. This was passed in 2022. And this is a volumetric tax, so it's based on the proportion of how many metric tons of lithium carbonate equivalent would be extracted and produced from this area. From the revenue from that lithium, 20% of the tax is supposed to go to a Salton Sea Restoration Fund. The other 80% goes to Imperial County, and 30% of that 80% is supposed to go to the most directly affected communities. Those are the ones that have those green dots there closer to the Salton Sea, which again experience a lot of those ecological problems locally. The county also received $5 million to do a programmatic environmental impact report, to conduct a health impact assessment, to do community engagement, and to hire an ombudsperson. And there's now also the establishment of an oversight committee for this tax and its distribution. Beyond this, also San Diego State University received $80 million to establish a new STEM center at Brawley in Imperial County as well. So there's Imperial Valley College has some exciting new workforce development training opportunities. So there's a lot of good news as well about how people are able to get ahead of this and really maximize benefits and minimize the kind of burdens from this potential extractive industry. So what are some next steps? Well, we are doing a lot of community engaged research on water, on energy, on environmental justice, really across the life cycle of lithium. I'm fortunate to have funding from the National Science Foundation as well as the Environmental Protection Agency. And together with colleagues at other institutions, we're analyzing all these different kinds of water and energy transitions and their implications in the US, especially in the West. I'm also fortunate to be the principal investigator of what's called the Lithium Valley Equity Technical Advisory Group. This is a group that we formed to, and we receive support from some of the community engagement funds that the county has received in order to provide strategic advising and also, doing community outreach related to, really spreading awareness about this development project. And we're doing that in partnership with the Lithium Valley Community Coalition that includes environmental justice, social justice, and labor groups as well. In particular, I work closely, I mentioned, with Comité Cívico del Valle. But beyond that, I also serve on the county's academic task force. So I'm providing feedback on all these planning documents, like that land use plan that we saw just a moment ago, as they're coming out. And we're at a really interesting moment right now, because actually in the next couple months, the county is about to come out with its programmatic environmental impact report and its specific plan for this rather complicated and ambitious project. So please keep an eye out. It's going to be something that's going to be in the news. It's going to be really an interesting moment to see how they are planning to mitigate some of the concerns that have been raised, and how they're going to also, again, maximize some of those potential benefits. So that's what really we're focused on right now, is making sure there's as strong as possible mitigation measures, and that there's also not just protection of environment, but also tribal cultural resources. So in order to ensure that, there have been some companies that have been already trying to seek approvals for development before the programmatic environmental impact report. Even though that's the case, and some of them have gotten approvals, our community partners at Comité Cívico del Valle, as well as Earthworks, have actually filed a lawsuit relatively recently appealing one of the approvals for one of the geothermal lithium developments by a company called Controlled Thermal Resources. And the idea, again, is just to really make sure that there's as strong protections and mitigations as possible for the wetlands, for public benefits, for collaborative environmental monitoring, and making sure that all those concerns about water and air quality and waste streams are going to be addressed. I've got a grant right now from the 11th Hour Project, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and that is funding work on a report and a toolkit that is looking at the role of community benefit agreements in a just transition more generally. So this is in particular going to inform some of the negotiations of the Lithium Valley Community Coalition, but it's also drawing lessons from some of those relationships between communities and companies globally, as well as what's happening right now in the United States, not just with lithium, but other kinds of so-called critical materials, or generally across the battery supply chain. And that's going to be published by the Climate and Community Project. And then finally, we're trying to do some global coalition building as well to avoid, what could be described as this problem of kind of green sacrifice zones. I recently had the tremendous privilege of hosting one of my closest collaborators from Chile here in California, and was able to, have a wonderful meeting between him and some of our partners locally in Imperial Valley. And they could discuss, their experiences with these different development projects, what kinds of lessons have they learned, and how could they potentially make sure that they're going to, again, really make sure that this is going to be beneficial for communities here. Before I stop talking, I do want to just plug my book. This is on unrelated topics, but I did want to share that I have a book that came out relatively recently, just a few months ago with Cornell University Press, and it's called Salvaging Empire. It's based on my previous research, which was on sovereignty and natural resources, especially offshore oil and commercial fishing, as well as environmental science in the South Atlantic. So this is based on a lot of research that I did in the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas in Spanish, which is a disputed territory in the South Atlantic. So if you use that QR code, it should take you to the Cornell University Press website, and you should be able to enter this code 09B card, and you should be able to get 30% off of the book if you're interested. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much. I'm so grateful to be here. I really look forward to any discussion.